All right. This is so cool. When I was a kid, I never thought that I'd be able to broadcast stuff like this. It's neat. Yes. Okay. So I'm continuing chapter 3 of Democracy for Realists by Achen and Bartels. I probably say those names different every time. And chapter 3 is entitled Tumbling Down into a Democratical Republic, Pure Democracy and the Pitfalls of Popular Control. And so far in this chapter, we've read about the triumph of popular sovereignty in American political culture and party reform. And the next section is called The Absolute Sovereignty of the People, the Initiative and the Referendum. Just as the adoption of the direct primary represented an attempt to circumvent party bosses and allow every citizen to exercise his choice by direct vote without the intervention or interference of any political agency, so also the contemporaneous movement to establish initiative and referendum procedures represented in an attempt to circumvent elected legislatures by establishing the power of the people to make or unmake laws. The aim was nothing less than to restore the absolute sovereignty of the people, to make this in fact, as well as in name, a government of, for, and by the people, and as one of the leading proponents of direct democracy, Senator John Bourne, Jr. put it. Perceptive observers recognize the initiative and referendum movement as a reflection of dissatisfaction with the day-to-day realities of legislative politics at the turn of the 20th century. For example, A. Lawrence Lowell's study on public opinion and popular government proceeded directly from a chapter on loss of confidence in representative bodies to one on direct popular action. According to Lowell, quote, the growing distrust of legislative assemblies is due partly to the actual defects they have displayed, and partly to popular exaggeration of their faults, end quote. Henry Jones Ford was less measured in his assessment, arguing that, quote, the American people despise legislatures, not because they are averse to representative government, but because legislatures are in fact despicable, end quote. Certainly there was much to despise about the legislatures of the Gilded Age, which were often severely malapportioned in favor of rural interests, heavily influenced by party machines, and directly or indirectly controlled by powerful corporate interests. The head of the Direct Legislative League argued in a 1900 pamphlet that representative government has been tested on these shores for over a century. In many cases, it is better than the older forms. It has been acclaimed a finality, but it has borne in its legislative fruits, and they are the Dead Sea apples of corruption and insidious justice. Representative government is a failure. Interest coincides with justice, not in government, but in self-government, not in any form of rule by others, but in pure democracy where the people rule themselves. That was a quote. Sorry. While some proponents of pure democracy viewed corruption and injustice as the legitimate fruits of representative government, others viewed representative government as a legitimate in principle and direct democracy as an extraordinary expedient for addressing the current political crisis. For example, Ford argued that the leaders of the initiative and referendum movement in Oregon, quote, do not seek to destroy representative government. They want to get rid of a base imitation and introduce the real thing. When they accomplish the reorganization of public authority that they intend, they expect to drop the initiative and referendum out of ordinary use. They will then be kept in reserve simply for emergency use, end quote. Presumably, Ford would be surprised to learn that the emergency afflicting Oregon's representative government has now lasted for more than a century. Between 2000 and 2012, Oregon voters considered 107 statewide ballot measures, including initiatives and constitutional amendments referred by the state legislature. Political scientists of the progressive era recognized that it might be wiser to quote, wiser to confine the referendum to questions involving general principles alone and to the class of matters where the public is normally familiar with the facts required for a decision than to extend it promiscuously to questions where a rational opinion can be formed only by a knowledge of details with which the ordinary man does not readily become acquainted. End quote. Unfortunately, they could suggest no reliable means for distinguishing matters on which ordinary citizens might be expected to have rational opinions from those that would be best left to legislatures. Lowell argued that, quote, the size of the vote is a measure of public interest in the matter, and hence an indication of the extent to which the people are likely to have studied the facts necessary for a decision, and thereby formed a genuine opinion about the law. A decision by a majority of the votes actually cast upon a question is doubtless the most natural method to pursue in the case of a popular vote, but that such a result expresses public opinion may sometimes be a political fiction rather than a fact. End quote. In extreme cases, this sort of political fiction might be obvious to all. Lowell pointed to cases in Massachusetts and Michigan where constitutional amendments were adopted despite being approved by fewer than 3% of those who went to the polls. However, that sort of judgment could be made only in retrospect, and in any case an initiative procedure justified as a way to restore the absolute sovereignty of the people, as Senator Bourne had it, could not easily be reconciled with any systematic recognition of the possibility that, quote, public opinion may sometimes be a political fiction rather than a fact, end quote. Ironically, the institutions of direct democracy themselves were often established on the basis of less than overwhelming popular support. Table 3.1 provides a summary of statewide votes on measures establishing initiative and referendum procedures, popular recall of public officials, and related progressive institutional reforms from 1904 through 1912. These measures were culled from Lowell's complete list of statewide initiatives and referendums during this formative period. In each case, the table shows the yes and no votes as percentages of the total election turnout, as well as the roll-off, the percentage of voters who went to the polls but did not vote on the specific measure listed. And there is a large table on this next page here that just lists a bunch of referendums and initiatives that people voted on, and then there's a yes percent, a no percent, and a roll-off percent. And this is going to explain the results here. It is clear from the results presented in Table 3.1 that direct democracy almost always garnered plurality support when put to the voters. Indeed, in 16 of the 17 cases in the table, yes votes outnumbered no votes. The sole exception was a 1910 effort to expand the role of initiatives, referendums, and recall in Oregon, which had already accumulated extensive experience with those institutions. On the other hand, it is also striking that a third or more of voters failed to vote on many of these measures, and most of the measures that were adopted actually failed to win support from a majority of those who showed up at the polls. For example, proposals from a general initiative procedure and the recall of public officers on the 1912 Nevada ballot garnered pluralities of 8 and 10 to 1 among those who cast votes, but still failed to win absolute majorities because almost half the voters who went to the polls declined to support or oppose them. Maine and Colorado had similar experiences. The progressive stronghold of Minnesota, however, required an absolute majority at the polls to approve a constitutional amendment to establish the initiative and referendum. Despite very large pluralities in favor of 2 successive attempts, roll-off doomed the measure. The effort to establish the initiative and referendum in Minnesota then went into abeyance for more than half a century. The record of voting behavior on direct democracy measures in the early 20th century may seem to suggest that initiatives and referendums only rarely registered what Lowell referred to as genuine opinion. However, it is instructive to contrast the parallel record of voting behavior in a domain in which public interest seems to have been a good deal higher. Table 3.2 represents the results of all 15 statewide initiative and referendum votes between 1904 and 1912 pertaining to prohibition, local option, and liquor licensing and regulation. On most of these votes, more than 85% of those who went to the polls voted yes or no. The average roll-off was less than half that in Table 3.1. In Maine in 1911, repeal of prohibition failed narrowly, drawing less than 15% roll-off. In Colorado, 1912, more than twice as many voters saw fit to express their views about prohibition as about popular recall of public officers, or nonpartisan ballots. Clearly, voters could be moved to vote on issues they viewed as important in their day-to-day lives, but for many, the political institutions and procedures of direct democracy did not rise to that level, even in an era of unusual political ferment. Citizens in the progressive era seem not to have been much different in this respect from the politically disengaged contemporary citizens we portrayed in Chapter 2. Yeah, so in the referendum and initiative votes on direct democracy, there was a lower turnout than in the referendum and initiative votes on prohibition. Makes sense. This next section is called The People Themselves. A century after the wave of progressive-era reforms, more than 20 U.S. states have had substantial experience with direct democracy in action. What light does that experience shed on the virtues and pitfalls of pure democracy? One key question is whether the establishment of initiative and referendum procedures has, in fact, shifted power from political elites and special interests to ordinary citizens, as progressive-era reformers had hoped. From the start, skeptics claimed that what the initiative really does is to transfer the function of framing laws from official lawmakers to non-official lawmakers. But every such non-official lawmaker, being self-appointed and extra-constitutional, occupies an irresponsible position very similar to that of the party machine boss who holds no public office. Indeed, it did not take long for non-official lawmakers to begin to exploit opportunities for political entrepreneurship under direct democracy. According to the father and chief apostle of Oregon's direct democracy movement at the turn of the 20th century, W.S. Uren, just as soon as we got initiative and referendum through, we organized the People's Power League to back up measures we wanted the people to vote on, end quote. When asked whether the people of Oregon always have the vote you want them to, Uren replied, "They always have thus far." Concerns about behind-the-scenes influence in the initiative process have recurred throughout the century-long history of direct democracy in the American states. For example, V.O. Key Jr. and Winston Crouch observed of California in the 1930s that the initiators, quote, "The initiators of propositions have usually been pressure organizations representing interests, commercial, industrial, financial, religious, political, which have been unable to persuade the legislative to follow a particular line of action," end quote. In a 2000 book titled Democracy Derailed, political journalist David Broder similarly argued that quote, "Wealthy individuals and special interests have learned all too well how to subvert the process to their own purposes," end quote. Quote, "Though derived from a reform favored by populists and progressive as a cure for special interest influence," Broder wrote, "this method of lawmaking has become the favored tool of millionaires and interest groups that use their wealth to achieve their own policy goals, a lucrative business for a new set of political entrepreneurs. What was striking to me as I traveled the initiative states was the discovery that so many of the measures had been designed by a handful of people and were being sold with their dollars. Whether their motivations were financial or ideological, they had mounted this populist warhorse and were riding it hell for leather to achieve their own purposes," end quote. Another 15 years later, Bruce Kane, a political scientist with extensive practical experience in California politics, argued that attempting to check or bypass representative government via direct democracy simply empowers a new class of election entrepreneurs by delegating them the tasks of formulating policy, organizing the effort to get something on the ballot, and providing voters with the information and cues they need to make a decision. Whereas average citizens will sporadically give input to government when something really matters to them, Kane noted, organized interests are a constant presence. Pessimistic assessments of the relative influence of average citizens and organized interests are common among observers of the initiative process. However, a more systematic analysis by John Matsusaka of the policy consequences of employing the initiative process has challenged the notion, quote, that special interests use the initiative to thwart the will of the voters, end quote. Comparing fiscal policies in states with and without the initiative process over a period of 3 decades, Matsusaka identified 3 significant differences. First, the initiative reduces total government spending by about 4%. Second, the initiative shifts spending from state to local governments. And third, the initiative shifts the sources of revenue from taxes to user fees and charges for services, allowing fewer possibilities for redistribution of wealth. Drawing on survey data from a variety of sources, Matsusaka argued that each of these policy shifts was broadly consistent with the preferences of ordinary Americans and plausibly with the preferences of ordinary citizens in the affected states. Now, in one sense, Matsusaka's findings are utterly uninspiring. Any policy adopted by referendum or initiative must, by definition, be preferred by a majority of voters, and probably, barring substantial biases in turnout, by a majority of citizens, to the status quo. However, as we noted in Chapter 2, the range of policies that can be sold to a majority of the voters may be very broad indeed, leaving plenty of room for wealthy individuals and special interests to further their own purposes, as Broder put it, through agenda setting and framing. The tax reductions that Matsusaka finds in initiative states are particularly likely to disproportionately benefit the prosperous. This sort of selective appeal to popular opinion is especially likely in narrower, complex, less salient policy domains where public preferences are unclear or non-existent. However, the fundamental indeterminacy of public preferences is sometimes evident even on highly salient issues. An unusually clear example arose when voters in a Houston referendum declined to abolish the city's affirmative action program. According to a New York Times report, quote, the fundamental truth that seems to have emerged from the debate here is that the future of affirmative action may depend more than anything else on the language in which it is framed. Affirmative action proponents around the nation hailed not just the result of Houston's vote, but the phrasing of the referendum as a straight up or down call on affirmative action, and they said that is the way the question should be put to voters elsewhere. Its opponents, meanwhile, who are already in court challenging the city council's broad rewording as illegal, denounced it as a heavy-handed way of obscuring the principles that were really at stake. Pardon me. Who is to decide what principles are really at... Oh, that was the end of the quote. Who is to decide what principles are really at stake in a policy choice like the one facing voters in Houston? If we accept, at least for the sake of argument, that a referendum employing the wording originally proposed by opponents of affirmative action would have passed, as opinion polls indicated and most observers seem to have believed, would that result have been more or less legitimate than the actual opposite result? The doctrine of direct democracy provides no sensible way to answer such a question. In any case, even policies that are unambiguously preferred by a majority of citizens to the status quo may or may not be good policies in the broader sense of comporting with citizens' interests. Matsusaka was careful to emphasize that his evidence, quote, does not tell us whether the initiative process is a good or bad form of government. The evidence simply shows that the initiative promotes the will of the majority, end quote. However, a broader literature reviewed co-authored by Matsusaka and Arthur Lupia was much less circumspect in this regard, arguing that, quote, Every such study to date, assessing the impact of direct democracy on policy, points to higher or no worse decisions when the institutions of direct democracy are available." End quote. What constitutes a higher quality decision? As Lupia and Matsusaka acknowledged, quote, "It is difficult to come up with an objective definition of a good or bad policy," end quote. Thus, the evidence they offer ranges from anodyne. In this respect, the initiative process does not lead to prima facie irrational public policies, to heroically indirect. Swiss survey researchers find happier people in cantons with more direct democracy after controlling for income and other demographics. Any balanced assessment of the impact of direct democracy would have to weigh evidence of this sort against more concrete evidence from a variety of studies of specific instances of government by initiative in which the will of the majority has produced policies that are seemingly at odds with citizens' interests. For example, one of the more popular uses of initiatives in the modern era has been to impose term limits on elected officials. In the early 1990s, term limit measures were approved by voters in 20 of the 24 states allowing initiatives. Although some of these measures were subsequently struck down by courts, voters have shown considerable persistence in supporting term limits. For example, Nebraska voters approved successive term limit initiatives in 1992, 1994, 1996, and 2000. Supporters of term limit initiatives have displayed little regard for the cautions of political scientists regarding the likely unintended consequences of these measures. For example, in the run-up to the vote on California's term limit initiative, political scientist Nelson Polsby argued that, quote, "term limitations just shift power from elected officials to the relatively inaccessible officials, bureaucrats, and influence peddlers who surround them," end quote. Polsby's assessment is broadly consistent with subsequent evidence from surveys of state legislators in states with and without term limits, which found that legislative leaders lost significant influence in the term-limited states, while governors, legislative staffs, and bureaucrats gained influence. Thad-Kauser's detailed examination of the impact of term limits documented a variety of negative implications for legislative performance. As Kauser's title summarized it, a dismantling of state legislative professionalism. For example, legislative committees receive less deference in states with term limits, presumably because, quote, "shortened time horizons reduce the incentives of members to specialize in a policy area," end quote. In addition, quote, "term-limited legislatures play a diminished role in crafting the state's budget," a pattern Kauser attributed to less politically canny legislators giving up more ground to the executive branch in budget negotiations. Finally, term-limited legislatures produce less innovative policies, end quote, as gauged by their lesser utilization, flexibility, and federal program guidelines, and by their lower receipt of innovation awards from the Council of State Governments. Meanwhile, contrary to the expectations of proponents, quote, "term limits initiatives have not filled legislatures with citizen members," end quote. Instead, experienced professional politicians have mostly been replaced by less experienced professional politicians moving up the career ladder from local government positions. More recently, proponents of electoral reform have turned from term limits back to the nominating process. A century ago, the establishment of direct primaries marked the triumph of the doctrine that the will of the rank and file of party membership should prevail, end quote, as Key put it. But why, recent reformers ask, if popular sovereignty is our paramount value, should the choices of nominees be left to the rank and file of party membership rather than the public as a whole? In some states, open primaries have long allowed non-members to participate in the choice of party nominees. In 1996, California voters adopted a constitutional amendment instituting a blanket primary, in which primary voters could choose on a race-by-race basis which party's primary to participate in. Although blanket primaries were subsequently declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court, the short-lived experiment provided an opportunity to gauge the impact of more open primary rules. The result, according to a study by Will Bullock and Joshua Clinton, was that elected officials, quote, "moved away from the ideological extremists in their own party after the adoption of the blanket primary, but only in the most moderate districts, of which there are increasingly fewer." Thus, simply allowing more registered voters to participate in primaries is unlikely to be the panacea for elite polarization in legislatures that many believe." End quote. A broader study by Eric McGee and his co-authors likewise suggested that, quote, "the openness of a primary election has little, if any, effect on the extremity of the politicians it produces." End quote. Not to be deterred, California voters in 2010 adopted another formula for instituting a more open primary process, the so-called top two primary system. The top two system takes the logic of popular sovereignty one step further by replacing separate party primaries with a single ballot listing all the candidates for a given office regardless of their party affiliations. Primary voters vote for anyone, and the top two vote getters, regardless of party affiliation, advance to the general election. According to one prominent proponent, replacing party primary elections with a top two system would be a direct, simple fix for the hyper-partisanship and legislative dysfunction now gripping American politics. In its first test, 2012, the California top two primary seemed no more effectual than previous reforms. The Los Angeles Times headlined, "Few centrists advance in California's new primary system," a survey experiment comparing vote choices under the old and new ballot rules helped to explain why. Voters need fine-grained knowledge of candidates positioned to vote as advocates of electoral reform, predict the will upon the adoption of open primaries. Voters in the 2012 California primaries struggled to distinguish between candidates from the same party and were especially unfamiliar with challengers' positions. As a result, although voters tended to be moderate and a sizable portion were willing to break party ranks, the average voter was ill-equipped to do so in a way that led them to select more centrist candidates in contest for House and State Senate. End quote. Of course, to say that the top two primary has so far been ineffective in achieving the stated aim of its proponents is not to prove that it is a bad policy. More experience and broader analysis will be necessary to weigh its advantages and disadvantages. However, it does seem clear that the simplistic hopes of its backers were torpedoed by voters' lack of fine-grained knowledge, a lack that has loomed large in many criticisms of direct democracy more generally. As Kane noted, populist reform is likely to fall when it overstimulates citizen capacity and commitment, and when it ignores the critical role that intermediaries inevitably play in any large democracy. All right. We'll stop there. There's probably one more reading left in this chapter.